Hey everybody, it's about 6:03, so I think we'll go ahead and kick this off. So hello and welcome to the State of Field Architectural History at the University of Virginia. My name is Michelle Colbert. Myself and Samantha Sigmon are the co-presidents of the Thomas Jefferson Chapter of the Society of Architectural Historians here at UVA and moderators for today's panel discussion.
This event was born out of goals we created over the summer for the organization, which include a focus on encouraging cross-disciplinary and broad interests, collaborating with fellow students across departments, and foregrounding issues of equity in our historical scholarship of the built environment.
To officially kick off these initiatives, we are so excited to host this roundtable that showcases our professors in a forum where they can discuss what they are actively working on, who inspires them, and where they see the field of architectural history today.
As the United States reckons with its own complicated histories woven into the very fabric of the built environment, highlighting the diversity of scholarship and reasserting the relevance of architectural history within interdisciplinary humanities and design fields as an active cultural and even political practice is even more necessary. This panel will provide insight into contemporary scholarship within the field of architectural history and throughout other disciplines, and is intended as only a beginning to spark further conversations professionally and academically.
Now we would like to introduce our panelists in order that they will be presenting. First, we'll have Lewis Nelson, who is a professor of architectural history and vice provost for academic outreach. Then we'll have Erin Putalik, who is new this year as an assistant professor of architecture and architectural history. Then we will have Andrew Johnston, who is associate professor and director of the Historic Preservation Program. Shiqiao Li is the Whedon Professor of Asian Architecture and director of the PhD in Construction Environment Program. Lisa Riley is a professor and director of the Undergraduate Architectural History Program. Jessica Sewell is Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Environmental Planning, American Studies, and Architectural History, and co-director of the Center for Cultural Landscapes. And last but not least, we have Sheila Crane, who is Associate Professor, Chair of the Architectural History Department, and Director of the Graduate Architectural History Program.
You all do that so much. Just reading that off is just like exhausting, you guys. We have invited these panelists to prepare a short talk where they will share insights about their personal work, research, and recent inspirations. And we kind of open this up to whatever they really were excited about and wanted to discuss in whatever format that works for them. After these micro presentations that we'll kind of run through, we'll then ask a few questions for these scholars to answer, and then open the discussion for a few questions from the audience as well. So as you think of any questions or comments along the way, please put things in the Q&A tab below, and then we can see all of that and ask those questions to the panelists towards the end.
So as you guys can tell, we are extremely lucky to have a department filled with so many accomplished scholars, and we are so excited to be able to hear more about their work. So without further ado, Professor Lewis Nelson.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Samantha and Michelle for organizing this, and to TJSAH for all the great work that you've done for decades and to decades to come. Really proud and grateful to have you all among us. So my name is Lewis Nelson. I'm professor of architectural history here at UVA. Some of you may know me as the author of the recent volume, or the co-editor, I should say, of the recent volume, Educated in Tyranny, which is a great way to open the door to the conversation that I'd want to foreground today. That book really examines the academical village, the historic core of the University of Virginia as a landscape of slavery, to understand how the institution, our beloved academic institution, in fact, functioned as a landscape of violence and exploitation for its first half century. And it's important for us to recognize that people have written about slavery in Virginia and at UVA in the past, but when it gets tied to architecture, when it actually gets embedded in the visual imagination, and when we tie those histories to objects in the landscape that people can no longer avoid, they are forced to engage and to grapple with these questions. And so one of the things that is important for me in my work in the present moment, and some of the books that I'm going to highlight for you, other books that I've been interested in of late, I think it's really important that we recognize that architecture is material politics. Architecture is material politics. And it's important for us to recognize that in a moment, in our own moment, when politics is such an acute framework by which we understand our nation, ourselves, our individuals, our bodies, our relationships, our friendships, our families, politics is a critical framework for understanding all of that. We have to actually recognize that it's architecture that frames all of that. Architecture is the stage by which and the materialization by which those politics are instantiated. And so that's true in our moment, in our present moment, but it is also true in our recent past and in our distant past. So I'm going to show you just a few books that I've been inspired by of late that really grapple with some of these core questions. And I'm going to share my screen. Can I confirm that you all can see a white screen with 3 book covers on it? Excellent, great. So when I was presented by TJSAH to think about some of these critical questions, I actually wanted to go back to not just what I thought were critical engagements, but in fact what organizations thought were critical engagements. And so some of you will know that I'm the past president of the Vernacular Architecture Forum, the past editor of the journal Buildings and Landscapes, and have served on the Cummings Prize Committee on a number of occasions. And so I wanted to go back to the Abbott Lowell Cummings Prize, which is the top book prize offered every year on an annual basis by the Vernacular Architecture Forum, to understand what my colleagues in that particular subfield have foregrounded as critically important. And so I have on the screen for you those last 3 winners. 2018 on the far right, California Mission Landscapes, 2019 Spaces of Translation in the middle, and the most recent one, Borderland, Border Water, 2020. I want to make just a few quick observations about this. When you look at these particular books, there are a couple critical themes that tie these together. One is that in each instance, there is a politic that is foregrounded, right? In the title of California Missions Landscapes, the subtitle very directly says that this is an analysis not just of these buildings or this particular landscape or the cultural cohesion by which they functioned, in a kind of positivist framework, but it's really about race, memory, and the politics of heritage, right? That race, in fact, plays a really critical role in the shaping of these mission landscapes, and then in the reconstitution and the preservation of those mission landscapes, there's a politic of heritage that is directly at play. And as we all know, heritage is not a stable thing. It is not a historical framework. It is a political agenda, right? And the writing of history is itself a political act. Spaces in Translation is also a very interesting book because it looks not just at Japanese gardens in situ, but it actually is looking at the ways that Westerners have adapted and adopted various Japanese gardens for a variety of different functions, right? So this is a material palette that has been adapted in really, really interesting and complicated ways. Also, again, for sometimes more subtle, but subtle political motives. And then the most recent one, the 2020 winner, Alvarez's Borderland, Border Water, takes not a building type, not a particular building at all, but in fact takes a border and looks at the constructed realities, the constructed nature of that particular border. This is a critically important architectural history and a landscape history that in so many ways shapes our present moment, but it itself has its own history. And I wanted to take just a moment. Oh, it's not letting me do this. How do I? No, next. Let's do it this way. Okay, so this is the citation. This is a portion of the citation that was offered for the Cummings Prize for the Alvarez book. And I just want to highlight 3 phrases that were part of this citation. An expansive landscape. One of the things that architectural historians have long been recognizing, but clearly recognized in our present moment, is that we need an expansive view of the built environment. Architecture with a capital A, meaning the architectural production by professionally trained, Western trained architects, is no longer a field by which we can delimit our work. We must absolutely take an expansive understanding of the whole of the built environment to really have our historical perspectives contribute to the political discourse of the moment. So expansive landscape, that's incredibly important. We must not have the blinders on of professionalization, no longer useful. What constitutes the components of the built environment? We actually have to ask questions around, when we write about architecture, what in fact is architecture? What is architectural history? What are the various components that make this up? Which is why so many of architectural historians in my subfield have migrated towards landscape, right? Because the landscape is in fact the material palette by which a whole range of different components that we might traditionally think of as architecture or not think of as architecture, they're all active agents. They're all actors and characters. This last phrase, in our own day. Architectural historians must grapple with the realities of our present. We really must grapple with the realities of our present. Our histories are histories of political issues that we really must engage the discourses of our present day. And these are really critical moments for us. I also want to highlight, I know Lisa will be actually talking a little bit about her own book, but I wanted to bring Lisa Riley's book in here because in so many ways, her book does exactly this same thing. One of the critical observations I made when I was reading Lisa's book was the fact that in the construction of a Norman empire and a visual culture of Norman empire, it's actually not the formal qualities that unify the Norman empire. It's the strategies of adaptation that unify the Norman Empire. So when you actually look at the material product, you'll see very little visual consistency. But when you actually look at the structures and the systems by which those objects are made, the consistency is in the political organization. The consistency is in the structures of manipulation and adaptation to the present, not actually in the formal features. The last book I want to highlight is a book I'm reading right now. So I'll admit it, I'm not actually finished with it, but I'm so enamored by this book. I would offer it up to you. This is David Morton's Age of Concrete. It's a really fascinating study of concrete built housing in Maputo, the capital of Mozambique. And I just want to show just a few images of the interior. This is a recently published volume. What's so profound about David Morton's Age of Concrete is that he zooms in at fundamentally different scales. You can see the aerial view on the right-hand side, which shows actually the city of concrete, which is the formal, organized, funded, and then therefore white city below the arc. And then you can see the expansive burbs beyond that, right? The dense weaving neighborhoods that have no infrastructural investment. So he's thinking about massive scale. He's thinking about political organization. He's thinking about political structures. It's a political history of the country through buildings. But he also spent an enormous amount of time sitting in living rooms, listening to the oral histories of the older members of the communities that actually experienced this. The taking of these oral histories, the humility that he revealed in a decade's worth of work, sitting at people's feet and hearing their stories and using their stories uncaptured by archives as the way of framing the narrative of his book. That's the kind of ethics of commitment to the marginalized that is now central to the front edge of our work in architectural history. When we limit ourselves to listening only to credentialed experts, we're going to continue to perpetuate the hegemony of the institution. It's only when we sit down and listen to the uncredentialed, the marginalized, and foreground their stories, lift their stories up and move them to the center of the narrative, that's the moment that we'll actually be becoming a university that is great and good. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for that, Lewis. That was really interesting. Sorry, my timer's going off. Next we have,
in time.
Oh yeah, you were perfect on time, like to the second. So next up we have Erin Putalik.
Okay, hi everybody. You can see just a slide, hopefully. I'm a little bit new to all of this. I'm very excited to be in such accomplished company, and thank you so much to the coordinators and to everybody for coming. I can't imagine a better introduction to a department. As I mentioned at the new student orientation a few weeks ago, I finished my dissertation right before the start of classes and have just defended. So I'm currently in what my committee has called the post-dissertation haze, not necessarily in a place to make these kind of amazingly prescient observations, such as what has just been made. So I'm going to talk briefly about what I've been up to and try to paint a kind of hazy map of where I am as a scholar, and hope that it comes into sharper focus over the course of this year. So I'm going to take just a few minutes to summarize some of the main threads of my dissertation. And following this, I'm going to talk about 2 small writing projects that I'm currently working on and 2 collaborations that I've started up in the last couple of months. In many ways, the core ideas that I explored in my dissertation arose from my time in architectural practice. During this time, the ways in which our basic materials were treated as abstract commodities, except in the rare and almost fetishistic case of an emphasis on local materials, came to me to feel increasingly strange. In the most basic sense, my dissertation explores the connections between material sources and their final use in architecture. It begins with the basic premise that material choice in architecture has huge, unseen or obscured relationships to landscapes of extraction, or, as became the case with 20th century forests, of cultivation. Similarly, I've come to realize how our environmental imaginaries, regardless of their accuracy, as well as known or unknown, acknowledged or unacknowledged limits on the productivity of these source landscapes, condition how we use and value architectural materials, many times in ways that we as architects are totally unable to see. So in short, my dissertation explores how the construction and taste culture of American domestic architecture transformed, specifically with regard to how wood-based materials were used and valued, in tandem with transformations in the quality, type, and availability of the wood that was coming from American forests during the 1930s. It argues that the potent myth of the frontiersman and the log cabin can be shown as participant in the same reciprocities between forests, building materials, and taste culture as the post-war family in their low-cost and prefabricated plywood house. So my dissertation has two parts. In the first set of chapters, I draw out a set of ideas about wood in America, both as a finite resource and as a scientifically improved material, and then explore them and their implications for architectural production, specifically of the low-cost single-family home. Following this, I take a series of experimental plywood houses, all built in the 1930s, and look at them in terms of how they kind of signal a broader engagement in architectural culture with experimentation, and also how their use of plywood reflected its multivalent material interpretations. So I use a lot of these maps in the early chapters, and I'm going to kind of skim through much of what I look at. But basically, I was very interested in the way that these maps became the visual and scientific evidence of a growing conservation movement, and I compare those to the way that this sort of rhetoric or panic about rapid depletion was utterly suppressed in the architectural literature. So you see advertising kind of amplifying over the course of some of these more kind of intense debates within forestry and resource conservation, their rhetoric of durability and lastingness. So this kind of all turns toward a series of experimental houses that I'll talk about in the PhD colloquium in much more depth. But as our kind of growing interest in higher levels of utilization and efficiency begin to take over the remaining discourse of forestry, you get many of these very rapidly constructed, low-cost building systems that constitute the technology of much of our built world now, that were also heavily leveraged during the war and the subject of much visionary work for what the post-war world would look like materially. To move on to the small writing projects that I'm working on, I'm currently working on a chapter for an edited volume on the American Model House, which reconsiders the Luminaire House, which has most often been positioned as a kind of iconic example of early modernism in America. In fact, the Luminaire House was generated as a part of a series of highly innovative and relatively unknown low-cost housing proposals that were designed by Kocher and Frey between 1930 and 1935. The project was never intended to be understood in isolation, and the architects published numerous drawings showing dozens of luminaires densely arrayed on small near-urban lots. Sponsored by Alcoa, the house was the first of a series of industry partnerships for Frey and Kocher, wherein, let's see, how am I doing on time? I can't see anything here. Okay.
You have 3 minutes. You're doing
Okay.
great.
Still working on the technology. Wherein they reimagined construction systems in which materials such as cotton canvas, aluminum foil, and engineered wood were integral. So this paper looks closely at the context of Alcoa's sponsorship, but also more broadly at how architects in the 1930s joined with industrial partners in an intense search for novel low-cost construction systems. Let's see. The second writing piece that I'm working on looks at architectural materials that were increasingly made out of the waste or byproducts of forestry starting in the 1920s. By the 1920s, the debate around timber conservation began to recenter around the notion of utilization. This meant waste reduction fundamentally and entailed turning a higher percentage of the harvested forest into useful products. This also meant that architectural markets needed to be found for these products, which basically is what this paper traces. One of the most interesting things to me about this process is the distance between the rhetoric of waste reduction seen in many of the industry journals and the rhetoric of material pureness that was found in the architectural advertising. So this essay basically unpacks this strangeness while providing background and context for many of these reconstituted wood materials, many of which we still use today. And so just to quickly go over some of the collaborations that I've been developing. One is with a group of architects and theorists to begin to think more carefully about what currently feels to us like an unfettered enthusiasm for mass timber. For those of you who don't know, mass timber is typically made of smaller, younger, or faster growing trees, many of which have been laminated into large lumber. It's been heralded as a new super material by many, and it is in many ways, but also as a kind of utterly ethically uncomplicated material. So because it uses rapidly renewing wood types. So we're waiting to hear about a proposal, but are fairly dedicated to finding an outlet for the way that we combine our work between kind of sponsored practitioners and historians and theorists. Finally, a last collaboration, sorry, that's just gestating. I've just joined with 2 partners and we've gone through all the machinations of incorporating our small practice, which is called Proof Projects. The 2 people I work with work on sediment management in the Great Lakes. And they look at kind of ways to be much more projective and carefully attuned to social and environmental needs. And I've joined them with a similar set of questions about forest management. How can we look at ways that sustaining the health of the forests of the Southeast, and particularly of anticipating their changing composition and change in light of our changing climate, might be proactively engaged by architecture. So I think in aggregate, my current and recent work signals a desire to bring to the practice of architecture a more robust and layered understanding of the implications of material use, and in a kind of dream projection to begin to test models of practice that are more deeply aware of the processes of material production and that engage them in a more embedded, creative, and deeply researched manner. Thanks, guys.
Perfect, thank you. We're doing really great on time. So next up, and thank you for that. That was very interesting. Congratulations on your recent PhD again. So next up, we have Professor Andrew Johnston.
My thanks to everybody for attending this evening. Historic preservation, as construed in the United States today, is an American term, naming a particular practice emanating from specific historical circumstances in the US and guided for the last 50 years by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. Historic preservation, thus understood, is not necessarily a practice that others in the world understand. A main soapbox point I make is that we in the US have done a fairly poor job engaging with heritage practitioners and heritage practices outside the US. We don't do well on getting out information on our historic preservation practices when there is much here to offer from various entities, including the National Park Service. And we've not done very well engaging in international theory and practice in related fields with a variety of names, but all broadly situated under the term heritage studies. Heritage studies today includes, but is more than, preserving and displaying things of significance. It's both tangible and intangible. It's the subject of active public debate and reflection, and decisions about heritage have far-reaching effects. There are many centers of innovative work in heritage studies today. A few highlights to mention include activities in Australia, China, and Europe. In Australia, schools such as Australia National University and other universities are powerhouses of heritage theory, acting as a center for researchers working largely in Asia and connecting to the English-speaking world. China has an extremely dynamic practice community of national and international professionals working on a phenomenal range of topics and sites. In this sense, China's been a great laboratory for comparative practice, and this is the subject of a book project I'm working on, with the goal of making many of these contemporary international themes in heritage studies available to an English-speaking audience. In Europe, many universities have formed multidisciplinary centers for the study of heritage themes. English language graduate programs built to attract students globally force a global perspective on heritage themes. Programs I've come to know in Rome, Gothenburg, and Exeter have an international student body and an incredibly diverse affiliated faculty. We see a few such centers in the US, including the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, and UMass Amherst. There's also the development of multidisciplinary heritage studies groups, such as, I think most importantly, the Association for Critical Heritage Studies, ACHS. And this is perhaps the most exciting group to develop in the last decade, with really astounding conferences of global reach. Coming out of this conference, ideas for a critical heritage discourse, for example, would move debates about, let's say, authenticity from a scientific to a humanistic perspective. Here, authenticity is no longer a property inherent in an object, but a projection of beliefs, content, and ideology. It's seen as a dynamic and negotiated process, subject to a range of analyses, including structures of power, and asking questions about who decides and who is involved. A range of multidisciplinary journals also exist, including established journals such as the International Journal of Heritage Studies and Future Anterior out of Columbia, and newer journals such as Build Heritage out of Tongji University. Contemporary questions being explored include whose heritage and who decides, questions of identity construction, tourism and its uses and impacts, a wide range of questions involving race and ethnicity, questions of monuments and monumentality, explorations into emotion and affect, and of course, digital humanities and heritage, which is a real strength of work here at UVA. Recent titles and book series include ideas such as heritage and colonialism, heritage and sustainability, managing cultural landscapes, heritage, labor, and the working classes, and of course, intangible heritage in many guises. Our goal in historic preservation education in the US for our next generation of HP professionals is to engage with international heritage studies and practice as sources of dialogue and dynamism. This includes course content, international internships, and active participation in multidisciplinary international organizations. This also includes advocating for HP students to engage comparative theory and practice in their own classwork and thesis projects. Two examples. One recent graduate student of the master's program, Robert Edwards, who in his prize-winning thesis, and he also now has a published article based on this, used his grounding in international critical heritage theory and practice to inform his exploration of interpretation practices of sites of Black heritage in New York City. And one current undergraduate student working on a thesis concerning the idea of facadism in Alexandria, Virginia, has an exciting conversation ongoing with government preservation professionals in Melbourne and Sydney, where they've been working to combat facadism via tools such as the Burra Charter. His goal is a more meaningful preservation practice that lends value to the lives of the people who live behind the facade. To conclude, heritage studies is a dynamic field, and reciprocal engagement with this multidisciplinary field must be the future of historic preservation, theory and practice in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and that was awesome. A lot of things echoed from our historic preservation class last year. So moving right ahead, we have Shiqiao Li. Shiqiao, I think you might be muted still.
Right, what about now?
Perfect.
Okay, so thank you, Michelle and Samantha, for organizing this. I'm going to jump straight into what I want to present. I have several research projects in parallel. I'm going to choose one, probably one that's most peculiar, strange, which is really an editing of a double issue for a sociology journal called Theory, Culture, Society, entitled Against Ontology, China and Francois Jolien. Just quickly, Theory, Culture, Society is maybe not very familiar to us, but it's actually a top-ranked journal in cultural studies and sociology. The project here is to present something. Maybe I'll begin with some of the implications of what may be considered as the state of the field, or maybe a kind of a temperature taking of the field. I think there are probably three aspects of it, which I think it's relevant. And one is that history was actually a philosophical project when it was first conceived. I think Louis was hinting at this. If we just kind of look at Hegel and the way he framed history in his famous lectures on philosophy of history, and it was really not just kind of recording of events, it was really advancing a particular kind of view of the world of value. So at the beginning, and it was and it still is, a carrier of values in its structure. In Hegel, of course, his famous progression from the Oriental to the Greek and to the Roman and to the German way of life. Second is that this is really quite interdisciplinary, not in a kind of big way. Julian is in philosophy and sinology. I'm in architecture, and Scott Lash is in sociology. We have a whole bunch of anthropologists and people in cultural studies and literature and so on. The third one is actually we're asking a really fundamental question, which is the question of how to develop knowledge. I think we need it today. The assumption was that that ontology is a unspoken norm in the way we look at the world, and it asks the question, what is it that it is? And you know, this is kind of in French, qu'est-ce que c'est? It's really kind of asking what is, and that's a particular way of asking question. It looks at not only the ontological substance as the thing itself, but also at the epistemological categories. You know, it's a kind of a innocent word, but it actually has a much deeper meaning. So ontology is thus at the very basis of Western thought. So we want to ask a question: what is not ontological? The answer here, I mean, tentatively, is that the Chinese thought is not ontological, and this is played out. I don't know whether I have time to go through all this. It's quite a complicated kind of formulation. Maybe I can argue that Julian argues that the ontological thinking is about being. Être is really about what is the being of something. And the Chinese thought is really about entre, which is something in between. You know, what is going on, not so much in the fixities, but something that actually is in the voids of the fixities. You know, that's reflected in the way the Chinese speaks of time, which is really a duration between two fixed moments, space as the voids between two fixed locations. Lash wanted to bring that to the kind of very foundation of Western philosophy of causation. You know, in thinking about how things happen, causation is fundamental to Western thinking, and he wants to shift that to instead of talking about causation, we should or we could certainly talk about something else, which is efficacy, and not so much about what causes an action, but more like what kind of maturation and action we can develop from the propensity of a situation. What I want to take from this whole collaboration from the point of view of architecture is that I want to argue that ontological thought fulfills the potential of the language of predication, and language is important. The question, this is that, you know, the thinking, this is that subject-verb-object relationship is a fixed way of thinking, and it's certainly not universal, and the Chinese language works very differently in that sense, and that's really the kind of trajectory of my contribution in this volume, and it's tentatively now called Modern Landscapes as Thought Language, and this world map shows the linguistic divide of the world of the Sinitic language family and the Indo-European language family. The argument here is that they come from very, very different, dramatically different ways of composing language and therefore understanding the world. And this is just a map to show the language distribution and the predominant pattern of the spread of the Indo-European languages, which we all speak today. So the Chinese language works in a very different way, in the sense that it really begins and ends with a shape. So this is here is a kind of range of kind of representations of the idea of mountain, from words to real mountains, when it's translated into a garden landscape, you don't lose it. You don't lose the shape. You continue with it. It's in the painting, it's in the garden. And when you look at a garden in this way, it kind of really, you can still read it as thought, as language, as figure. So in things like this, it is combined with kind of, you can see on the wall, there are lots of writings that are actually like that. If we go to visit a Chinese garden, you realize that there's actually a lot of words and characters, things, they all combined together. So how does that differ from the normative way of we using language, Indo-European language that's made of a particular kind of structure? And so this is kind of a normative kind of an analytical diagram of the linguistic structure of a phonetic language, alphabetic language. This is made of signifier, signified, and referent. And this is really the language of predication, and the arguments here is kind of quite complex, and I'm really fast forwarding it in the sense that the signifier is a representation. It works as a sign. It represents as a sign. In the process, it kind of homogenizes everything into similar units. So meaning comes from differentiations of signs and, in the form of grammatical structure. So there's really a linguistic structure, grammar in the process, and it sees everything as grammar-like. This is what Derrida goes through in exquisite detailing of grammatology. And so if you look at the architecture, there's a lot of kind of grammar talking, grammar practice, and kind of development of compositions and designs through grammar, like in the Palladian villa, like in the recent reiteration of that kind of Palladian design principles as shape grammar, George Steiny and William Mitchell. Or if you look at the pattern language, it's really a language-inspired way of thinking about architecture or space syntax, but here Bill Hillier and Julian Hansen in terms of kind of seeing space and society as made of different kind of spatial choices that can be understood by breaking them down into modular components. Peter Eisenman, it's a very heavily kind of invested, project heavily invested in language. So very recently, I was trying to kind of deal with this issue of, okay, how do we actually capture that? The problem with a lot of the history describing Chinese architecture is that they actually use a kind of orthographic projection to depict Chinese gardens, which is really kind of missing the point, and it really does not work. So you're looking at that in the center image of the slide, and the traditional Chinese representation also doesn't quite work. It really, this is actually, these three images are actually describing the same garden. So I have, on the right, and try to kind of develop a way of capturing that layers of meaning through a combination of a kind of axonometric view, perhaps, and without that perspective. So the deeper question here, skipping a lot of details, is really coming to the question, garden landscape as thought language, do we have an alternative framework for architecture? Could there be an architecture of not the being of buildings and cities, which is a very Greek way of looking at architecture, but the between of material and ecological systems? And I would argue that is, very much embedded in the traditional Chinese garden landscapes. I don't want to create a duality here, and this is not thought as duality, and it is really an alternative. And this alternative is tantalizing as a possible way of kind of thinking about how space making can be understood and how perhaps ultimately the history of architecture can be written as an alternative. And today we actually have options of kind of Eurocentric history, but then we don't really have a genuine alternative that's available. So this special issue is not so much about writing that history, but more like kind of laying out the foundation on which that new history might be possible. So it's going to be a long process of development, and I'm certainly hoping that that's a possibility. So we have a whole bunch of really famous philosophers and not so famous young scholars, but very good thinkers and contributors from different fields, making up this wonderful volume of thinking through alterity. So I'm really excited about that. Okay, I'll stop here. How am I doing with time?
I think we're about all out of time, Shiqiao. But thank you so much for those really fascinating connections. Next, we have Professor Lisa Reilly.
Great. Thank you, Michelle and Samantha, for getting us off to such a great start. I love the idea of our coming together, and I appreciate all these people agreeing to put their faces in front of a computer for another hour and a half at the end of the day to hear what we have to say. I think that's just great. I will talk a bit about my research and some about teaching and some about some of the work our students are doing. I was just observing to my graduate seminar, I think it was last week, which is on a topic that never would have been possible when I was a graduate student in the medieval parish church at the very end of the Middle Ages, and how lay piety and everyday experience used that space and created it. And we were looking at readings that I can't imagine would have been assigned or even written all those years ago, from anthropology, from geography, from all kinds of different fields, kind of highlighting the interdisciplinarity that characterizes our explorations at this point. And hopefully, we can get this to work. There we go. Can you see my screen? You've already seen my book cover, thanks to Lewis, who really did read my book. I'm so impressed. But I still have a picture of it because he highlighted one aspect of the book, but what I think is also another one of the book's contributions, which is quite a current in architectural history generally at this point, is its discussion of medieval culture, which was very much constructed around a series of binaries that were traditionally invoked to explain that culture as a variety of separate and distinct compartments with very clear boundaries stylistically between Byzantine, Islamic, and what's known as the Latin West or Romanesque. And this view of the Capella Palatina with Byzantine mosaics, Roman columns, and a Muqarnas ceiling was highlighted as, you know, these kind of separate traditions, as if Muslims would look at the ceiling and Byzantine Christians would look at the mosaics and everybody else would just look at the columns. But on closer study, that seemed very much not to be the case, that culture mapped onto religion in these kind of clear and discrete units. In large part, these were set up following a kind of colonialism very aptly described by Edward Said quite a long time ago, in which Islam had to be seen as other and always distinct from Christian Europe, whether Western or Eastern, despite the fact that Islam has close ties politically, religiously, and culturally to these other political systems and religions in the Mediterranean. And I think that's one of the book's kind of major contributions and a big part of how we think now outside these kind of stylistic boundaries many of us were trained in. And this brings up another area of concern for me, addressed most directly by my teaching and survey in particular, because as some people know, I've been teaching the survey for most of my 30+ years here. And that's acknowledging and addressing the bias inherent in the construction of our historical narratives that give us different kinds of surveys. And while I'd always address the notion of architectural history as a construct and the idea of bias in the survey, it had never really been foregrounded in the course. And while I decided as I began to revise it last spring for the coming semester to give it more attention, the murder of George Floyd and the events following that horrendous event gave new impetus to that issue. And so we started the course this semester with a reading about historical bias and a discussion about that and how the survey was constructed. And I asked the students to come to class with examples of historical bias from their own past history instruction, mainly in high school, because most of them are first years, which was very compelling, particularly to hear their tales of history instruction in the state of Virginia. So many of them are here. And it's also compelling because we're at this moment where we're wrestling with the relics of a particular narrative constructed against the background of Jim Crow that's now being dismantled. We're seeing how the discourse of history is so central to our experience. And with the help of the Black Lives Matter movement, we're beginning to understand how that false narrative that statues like the Robert E. Lee, shown in a picture from just a couple of weeks ago from Richmond, has affected all of us and shaped our outlook for all of us, as well as highlighting the centrality of history, commemoration, and the built environment to our daily lived experience. We talked about how we're seeing history right in front of us being deconstructed or taken apart in this moment and reconstructed again with changes to the built environment as represented by this particular example considered critical to the process itself. So I feel like history's never been more central to kind of current events in all the years I've been teaching the survey. And then finally, I wanted to touch on the issue of digital tools, which Andrew Johnston's already brought up, aspect of the field that's really transformed how we can represent knowledge, but also the kinds of questions we can ask. And one of our graduate students, Hannah Wolf's project is particularly addressing aspects of this, how this use of digital tools is also sometimes employed as a tool of intellectual and artistic colonization. And I'm bringing this up out of my familiarity with her thesis as her advisor. And this is a picture of the reconstruction of the Triumphal Arch at Palmyra destroyed by ISIS and positioned in potentially one of the most colonial of settings, I have to say, in front of the National Gallery in London on Trafalgar Square, right by the statue of Lord Nelson. And digital humanities, digital tools are an area I became involved with pretty early on as I recognized its ability to transform our power to analyze and interpret architecture. And now with Hannah's help, how we represent and what that digitalization represents in terms of what it's doing. And I thought it was crucial to bring that power to our students, several of whom have gone on to be leaders in this field through their expertise in this area. Andrew mentioned it's a big strength of our program, and our students have become major contributors to the field overall. It's also come up with regard, whoops, I didn't really mean to go backwards. There we go. With regard to Notre Dame, this kind of highlights some of the new aspects of preservation and conservation with regard to digital tools. The discussion around Notre Dame gives heightened exposure to how digital tools have transformed the field, because here we face a situation where we can actually replicate a damaged building in a more literal and exact way than ever before, in part because of the amazing scanning work done as represented on the right of this image by the late Andrew Tallon. And the question remains, should we or how should we approach such replication as Hannah's analyzing in more detail? And we'll also come up in more detail in a webinar I'm giving for the Office of Engagement next week. So these are just a few of the many ways in which the field's completely been transformed and changed for the better as it diversifies the kinds of buildings it looks at, the kind of people it brings into the discussion, and the kinds of questions that are asked. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Reilly. Hannah is one of the MA students, for those of you that don't know. Her work is incredible. Thank you. So next, we have Professor Jessica Sewell.
Okay, and let me share my screen. All right. This is just because I don't know whether how much people know who I am. I consider myself undisciplined. I'm connected to multiple departments, but I am a historian, right? So I'm a feminist historian of cultural landscapes, cities, buildings, and things. I teach on material culture in American studies. I teach on cities and on buildings in the context of the School of Architecture. Right now I'm teaching one class on gender, sexuality in the built environment and another on race in the American city. So these questions of difference and of power are really foregrounded in what I'm thinking about in terms of teaching. Also in terms of my research, right now what's on the front burner is actually this book on the feminist approaches to vernacular architecture. That's going to be part of a series that's sponsored by the Vernacular Architecture Forum. So it's about how to study gender in vernacular architecture. But I'm also working on mid-20th century masculinity in the bachelor pad. Someday I will finish the book. And also doing the furthest back burner is a project on digital project on the cultural landscapes of Suzhou, China, where I lived for 3.5 years before I came here. But I wanted to say what's really exciting to me in the field of architectural history and architecture history more broadly. One of the really important things in my point of view is, is that the field of architectural history is beginning to face up to the ways that it has used politically and socially, right? So this is what Lisa's talking about in the way that she's reworking and changing the focus of the survey to begin to say, okay, how is architectural history engaged in part of colonialism, part of racist structures, right? And so there's a moment, right, in particular in this last spring, the Society for American City and Regional Planning History, which if you don't know, it is a really important planning history, architectural history more broadly defined, right, did a particularly strong statement on Black Lives Matter. It also pushed organizations that have been traditionally a little bit more academically conservative, like the Society of Architectural Historians, to begin to recognize that we need to include scholars of color at all levels and really pay attention to race as an important piece of what's going on in architecture and in architectural history. And also the Society of Architectural Historians publicly took a stand advocating for the removal of Confederate monuments from public spaces, really becoming political in a new sort of way. Another piece within the Society of Architectural Historians is that they have just in this last year, starting in December of 2019, started to make created these affiliate groups, which begins to make institutional space for people and topics who've been marginalized by the organization. And I will admit, I've sort of moved in and out of being a member of SAH, and finally now, because they do have these groups where those of us who are dealing with gender, those of us who are dealing with race can explicitly speak with each other, and that they're recognizing the difficulty of being in a minoritized position within the field, right, that they're working to create some new space. And I think that's actually really important. It's going to make a difference to what we study, how we teach, right, all of these things. In that context, two of the books that I'm most excited about are the brand new collection on race and modern architecture, and this book by Adrienne Brown on the Black Skyscraper, in particular because the project on masculinity has a lot to do with modernity. Right, so I'm really interested in this, and also in the ways that race, whiteness is part of the bachelor pad, and whiteness is part of the suburban ideal the bachelor pad sits against. And I'm really interested in making sure that thinking about how that whiteness is being defined, and sort of redefining the city as a white space in the context of white flight. And I think it's really important that we have this kind of broad, intellectually engaged discussion that is going on within architectural history that goes beyond questions of individual Black architects and beyond questions of the spaces of slavery, as important as they are, to really think in a really broad way about how race is part of the ways that we think about architecture as well. Also, in terms of the architectural teaching, I'm sure this is a big piece of what Lisa is using. The Global Architectural History Teaching Collective is a resource that is really working to create a platform for sharing, allowing teachers to make architectural history more global and explicitly anti-racist. They're actually paying faculty members to create lectures, including especially most recently several explicitly anti-racist lectures that then faculty anywhere can make use of to do in their own teaching. It gives us a way of being able to not to have some knowledge available to us. All right. And one last thing that's all interconnected that I'm really excited about is new modes of publication, and particularly this online journal called Platform. And what's really exciting about Platform is it's a digital publication that works in short form. And what it does is it makes space for topical writing, for experimental writing, for intervention, for critical conversations about pedagogy. Andy and I actually did a piece on materials. I'll send that along to you, Erin. In this, but it makes it possible to immediately respond, to see how architectural history is part of the current day, part of the arguments that are going on, and make space for things that the traditional publication outlets both tend to be slow in their response, but even more make space for experimental and political argument, right? To really understand how is architectural history more broadly understood part of politics at all levels. So these are the things that are exciting me.
Great. Thank you for that, Jessica. And we are doing amazing on time. So last but surely not least, we have Professor Sheila Crane.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to both you and Samantha for doing such good work with TJSAH. And thank you for everyone who's still able to be with us tonight. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my current research that, my research is focused on for a long time on the history of modern urbanism and architecture, and particularly the intertwined histories of Europe and especially France with North Africa, looking particularly in Morocco, its history of being a French protectorate beginning in 1912 and its post-colonial aftermath. And also Algeria, which was claimed by France in 1830 and turned into an experiment in settler colonialism until a very violent war of independence that ended in 1962. So I've long been engaged in rethinking how cities and built landscapes across this geography have been shaped by histories of imperialism, anti-colonial struggle, and the unfinished project of decolonization. And I think these are particularly urgent questions in relationship to cities like Casablanca and Algiers that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about of late, that especially insofar as these are cities that have long been described as laboratories for urban modernity and for architectural modernism, imagined to be a kind of one-way transfer of ideas from France to colonial spaces. So I am currently working on a project that began actually thinking about that trajectory and began as an investigation of the history of urban planning and housing in French colonial North Africa, and shifted its perspective as I found myself less interested in solely looking at iconic master plans and innovative housing solutions like this one that had long drawn the attention of really important work by architectural and urban historians, and instead became increasingly fascinated by the urban landscapes that served as a kind of foil to these projects. And in fact, this is a view from the rooftop of that same project that you saw in the previous slide. So this dialogue and proximity of spaces that served as the sites, the structures, inhabitants, and lifeways that were incessantly targeted for displacement and elimination in this rhetoric of kind of providing solutions in the form of new housing models. So I turned my attention away to the urban landscapes in the background of this photograph and the sprawling developments known in the French colonial and French context as bidonville, which has become the topic of a book that I'm currently trying to wrestle to in conclusion. So the book attempts to consider the emergence of what is described as this new form of urbanization. Bidonville is essentially the French equivalent of shantytown, or of what we would now refer to as informal settlement. But I'm interested in the term and the work that it does. Bidonville literally translates as something like oil barrel city, or maybe tin can town, and really is about the materials being used to create residential developments largely constructed by recent rural migrants to cities like Casablanca. So my book is tracing the kind of emergence of this term that really comes to light in Casablanca in the late 1920s, and the work that idea and the mapping and the constant proposals for reordering of these spaces has done over time. So it's really looking at the long afterlife of the invention of the idea of the bidonville. And I couldn't resist but sort of put together a kind of perverse set of reference points that maybe suggest the really divergent touchstones that have informed this project. I mean, I'm really interested in Damish's now very old book on the origin of perspective, and his insistence and questioning the historian's desire to offer a definitive solution to the question of origin. And I think is a useful caution for me, even as he offers an incredibly robust set of perspective stories. And I've also been really interested in the work of Mitchell Dunier in this really amazing book on the ghetto, the invention of a place, the history of an idea. And in my own work on the bidonville, interested in trying to both understand a particular set of constructed landscapes that are embedded in and not detached from the city, that are inhabited spaces, but that are also a conceptual device that is used to very particular ends, and whose history changes, history as an idea and a concept changes over time. So images like this one have helped to solidify the understanding both in the 1940s when it was taken, and now that the bidonville was a spontaneous, unplanned, and essentially illegal settlement, removed from and outside of normative structures of planning. So much of the project has been also informed by the work of Anya Roy, who has quite compellingly questioned our conception of the informal versus the formal city, that these are, the informal is much a product of systems of regulation and of planning as the seemingly formal planned city. A lesson that's been really instrumental in the kinds of things that I've been looking at that include really thinking about how these sites really have to, and the very invention of the idea of the bidonville needs to be understood in relationship to a much longer history of territorial strategies and explicitly racialized logics of mapping and enclosure that were fundamental to French imperialism, that included the kind of wholesale usurpation of land, but also the defining of different administrative areas, so that in this context, the lines between urban and rural are highly politicized and actually instrumentalized categories that need to be understood against this longer historical backdrop. I've also been really interested in the material histories of the bidonville, the reference to the oil barrel that it's often understood in relationship to. And certainly Casablanca was a place of rapid industrialization and the creation in a very short amount of time of a massive manufacturing district and port area that was all about creating a landscape of extraction and cultivation to the profit of France. But in fact, the bidonville maybe is more tied to the rise of industrialized food manufacturing in Casablanca and the production of canning, food canning and preserves, as much to that as to the oil barrel. And tied to much more localized landscapes of extraction that led to the development in the 1920s and 1930s of this booming industry of dwarf palm fiber, a plant found largely in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, that was marketed as filling for the upholstered seats in cars. So there's a kind of like interesting layered sense of the material networks through which the bidonville that is produced that also are tied to indigenous practices of dwelling that used similar materials. So I'm interested in looking at both the existing material practices of building dwellings that are a part of the history of the bidonville and their transformation through colonial capitalism and the creation of manufacturing. So that in a kind of having that dual view in some ways of how dwarf palm fiber is both utilized to create this new manufacturing commodity, but a material that also has this long history in relationship to local building practices, begins to give us an interesting view of the bidonville, both from the outside and from the inside. So that what's been interesting for me to discover in looking particularly not only at these kind of material the networks of materials, travel, and transformation, but also at the history of the implementation of this master plan for Casablanca that drove its development through the 20s and into the 1930s, are the ways in which the new kind of property law instituted under the protectorate actually created kind of two systems where the European laissez-faire kind of real estate investment led to speculative development of the city, but stood side by side with the retention of certain aspects of Moroccan real estate practice. And that in fact, the bidonville is a part of, and often spaces that are taking advantage of the very regulatory mechanism and this kind of bifurcated system of property that allowed Moroccans to actually develop spaces within the city. And that you can see actually traces of this kind of building the city from below, even in, if you look very closely at this majestic rendering of Henri Prost's plan for Casablanca. And a neighborhood that I've been very interested in called Derb Galef, that was actually strategically leveraging both European and Moroccan/Islamic property law to allow for subdivision and creation of a community that effectively resisted its incorporation into Prost's plan. And so that by sort of reading Casablanca from Derb Galef and its history, my aim is to try and not pit this view of Casablanca over the one we're familiar with, but to really try and think about how we integrate histories that often have been either seen as completely separate or that, certainly the history of Derb Galef has long been overlooked, but tells us as much about Casablanca's urbanism and modernity as the iconic plans and buildings that are much more familiar. So the project does look at more than just maps and postcards, but those are certainly some of the materials that I find particularly compelling. And I know that I'm not alone in really wanting to think at once about large scale kind of systemic effects that help to shape the built landscape, but also really wanting to dive deeply into the specificity of both historical and spatial of particular sites. So I think that those are, preoccupations of mine, but certainly shared by many of my colleagues in the wide and interdisciplinary and interesting field of architectural history. So thanks for sticking with us for so long, and I will turn things back to Michelle and Samantha.
Yeah, hi. Okay, hello. Thanks so much again for that. Once again, it's amazing moving through so many of these complicated ideas and having to do it with this. So as I reiterate, I really hope that everyone realizes it's just a very initial conversation, and keep these conversations going with these people because it's all fascinating moments and facets. Since we're running a little short on time, I'm going to ask one question and then see if anybody else has any. So if you want to, please put any in the Q&A and we will get to you. This question, I was trying to be like really nice and write out questions in advance, and then I realized I came up with a whole lot of questions as I was going. So you'll forgive me with sort of the scratchiness of this question. But as scholars think about grappling with ideas and words such as authenticity, expertise, primary sources as sort of writing specific, and evidence, how might we challenge the primacy or hierarchy of these longstanding standards of what is appropriate research, so that we may more directly question who makes and interprets history and what it means to be a trained architectural historian.
I think one person whose work I would look at for that, Andrea Roberts, who came and spoke this was last year for us, and who works on freedom towns in Texas, because her work is very much based not on sort of the traditional, the physical object field work, right, but instead on conversations with people who are connected to the freedom towns, and really sort of making their knowledge and their presence central. I think she's somebody who's really doing amazing work and really important work in both preservation and architectural history in that way.
I mean, I think that you raised a really interesting question about, you know, what kinds of evidence people use. And I think, you know, if you look across the commentary this evening, that, and Lisa was sort of reflecting a little bit on this, I think that there were a pretty clear set of expectations about what constituted architectural history. And that what is exciting to me is the degree to which this is a field that moves in so many directions, and that one can now find models of people doing such wide range of work and dealing with such extraordinarily different kinds of evidence that you know, moves far beyond the familiar kind of visual and textual documents to the kinds of things that Jessica was just describing, oral histories, community engaged work, and other strategies that are now really central to the discipline.
Okay, so thank you for those answers. We do have a couple questions in the chat. I'm gonna field just a few of them. One pertaining to kind of the pandemic. This is from Olivia Hook. She said, thank you so much for great presentations. In the current time where mobility to travel to archives and conduct interviews is slightly limited, how does this affect not only dissertations and books that are being written currently, but in the larger field? And I also want to extend, what are some projects that maybe you are working on, or other people that you know in the field, other scholars are working on, that is using the pandemic as kind of a subject or a lens to look through?
I mean, I think the Global Architectural Theory and History Collective has done some really interesting panels thinking about pandemic urbanism through a broader historical field. And so it seems like there's a lot of interest in actually bringing to bear the lessons of history in that arena as well. I mean, I do think, Olivia, you asked a great question. And I think it maybe is a little bit too soon to tell. Some libraries are beginning to open up, and what the longer term effects of all of this will be is unclear, but I think it also does suggest the relevance of working at multiple scales, and also the importance of collaborating as colleagues between students and faculty. I've been fascinated by the emails that I've received of people asking me to send me copies of an article that I published. And I think we should be doing a lot more of that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, just me as a grad student, it's been a very interesting time to try to write a thesis and to gather primary source documents. But I've been seeing a lot of interesting projects come out of the pandemic, and just the fact that we can have, I think we reached our max of 130 participants this evening, that many people on Thursday night attend, I think that's saying something in itself.
I can add a brief kind of end note to that. I think part of what's been really exciting, I finished my dissertation in the pandemic. I wrote chapter 3 in my car. So that is the kind of fun aspect of doing something like this. But the other part is I've been able to send links to JSTOR and to many new HathiTrust resources that have been made much more accessible because people know that people are having a harder time getting into libraries that don't have institutional affiliations. So I feel like the kind of paywalls or boundaries around a lot of this digitized information have been temporarily removed, which has been really interesting to share and beautiful to share with people who don't normally have so much access.
Great. Yeah, I talked to other people about this, how it's all just like a bunch of squares, like who's going next? We don't know, but we're working it out. There's a question about how is the state of architectural history advancing knowledge of practical building in addition to technological history and material usage, which I think is a really interesting way to talk about this too. Can architecture as a direct discipline approach building history in ways other than technology?
Absolutely. Right. I mean, I think what's really important is that architectural history is really saying we need to look at this history not as a history of how we build things or of a history of what buildings look like, which is what very often happens in studio, which is that you look at case studies to sort of see, what does this look like? But instead as a way of thinking about how are architecture and the social intertwined with each other, right? And I think if we're going to make better buildings and do better architecture, we need to be addressing that social history and really understand that what's important is not the history of what things have looked like, but of how the designs have interacted with the ways people organize families, the ways that race is organized, the ways that work is organized. And I think actually the pandemic is a moment where people are beginning to say this, hey, wait a second, I was interviewed for a piece on the history of the home office, because all of a sudden everybody's got a home office and you're trying to figure out, okay, what is this thing? How do we make this work in a house? Or the stuff that Sheila was talking about, there've been more than one piece on pandemics and urbanism in platform as well, right? So beginning to say, okay, what effect do pandemics have on the physical form of the city and vice versa? So yes, there's a lot that architectural history has to say to architects if they'll listen.
Well, I think there are also different levels of use of history and different kinds of uses, and some are really direct, like in preservation, renovation, like in basically kind of maintaining some kind of historical fact. Historical knowledge is crucial, but also in understanding longer patterns of social developments and community formation and so on. I think history is certainly right up there to provide understanding, and that really serves as a crucial kind of conceptual device in the design. I mean, like our default mode is, of course, to do more of the same, and history is there to tell you that, think again, more of the same. So that really is fundamentally important, sometimes very often more important than knowledge of technology. And the third level is really in the kind of philosophy of history. And that's really something that will remain a crucial component of our intellectual life, and it will remain really important. And if we neglect that side of life, and certainly bad things will happen. So as we probably know, looking around today. So I think all these levels, history really functions. It's a complex, and it's probably the most intuitively primary intellectual project in human life. You know, we begin by telling stories, and behind the stories, there are morals. You know, so this is really how this whole enterprise comes into being. So certainly more important than many of the professional practice details. I'm talking about this from someone who actually spend a lot of time in practice.
Yeah, if I could just, is there enough time for me to quickly piggyback on that comment? So I think, Fred, thank you so much for the question. As someone who works kind of explicitly on materials and technology, I also think that it's a really important lens through which to interrogate our kind of ongoing faith in technology as a kind of social problem solver. So that's what I mean, in my work, I look almost exclusively at low cost, super cheap building systems and materials that are also linked to a range of ways in which discrepancies in inherited wealth are perpetuated through generations. And so just simply looking at a kind of historical moment when we deeply invested in the technology of construction in order to kind of address widespread housing problems, you can begin to kind of unpack how that unfolds in the present day. So I don't think technology is the only lens by any means, but it's deeply imbricated with many other ways of understanding the history of our built environment.
Great. So we have time for one more question, and this one was quite a long one, but I'm going to pull out kind of a two-part question to, to go on. So the question, what is the interdisciplinary role of architectural history and theory within the practices of architectural and landscape design? And vice versa, how might the logics of the design practices of our school engage the pressing issues of a historical discourses in its pedagogy?
Maybe I can have a go at the first part of the question, which is about the disciplines. As I've kind of said in a couple of other occasions, and I really think that the disciplines in inverted commas within our school, they're really not true division. They're not really kind of genuine disciplinary divides. I do think they're thinking across much larger divergence is crucially important for the health of knowledge. I think disciplines have, you know, a relatively short history of a few hundred years, and I think we've so kind of deeply invested in this idea. I think a lot of the investment comes from the push of the capital and its accumulation, and I certainly think that condition of, you know, which is a kind of historical reflection of how we got to where we are today, is something that we should definitely reconsider in a profound way.
I mean, I'd just like to add to that I think our department has a really interesting situatedness within and beyond the school, that we are a kind of bridge between the school and the rest of the university. You know, many of I mean, Jessica is a great example of that insofar as she teaches in American Studies. Many of our students cross those boundaries. So I think that is part of, we are both in dialogue with colleagues within the school and the work of landscape and architecture and urban environmental planning, and even situated in many cases with two, I mean, Shiqiao, Erin, Jessica are all kind of dual, triply oriented folks. So I think it is kind of inherent to the DNA of the historian to have that capacity to engage across disciplines. But I also think that the role of the department has historically, and I hope it continues to be, something that allows for a kind of bridge to a conversation with a broader university, in addition to a conversation within the school.
I would also say part of that interdisciplinarity is that many of the people who are in the department, like Shiqiao, like Andy, are also professionals, right? Are licensed professionals, are like Erin, right? So there is a way in which once you're in architectural history, everybody assumes that's all you are. But in fact, architectural history is incredibly expansive. We've been engaged, even for people like me who's not a designer, but I've taught design, I've been engaged with, been in architecture departments and in planning departments. So we all have feet multiple places, right? We're not just kind of an ivory tower within the School of Architecture.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a wonderful way to end this for sure. I've always had that problem of like fitting into a discipline and what that's supposed to mean, and challenging that a lot. And so I really appreciate everyone sort of talking about those issues, and thank you for Michelle and I to the continual support of our faculty and our staff that helped put this on. And then just talking to everybody, I know TJSAH, we want to collaborate with you and like do these kind of things, grapple with these topics, challenge them and support them, and all of the above. So whoever has ideas across departments or across roles, that's always something that we really want to welcome this year, as we said, as one of our major goals. And thank you to the audience. We got an amazing participation, and I wish that we could answer all the questions, but hopefully they're getting to some people that can maybe get back to some of you. So thank you again. And Michelle's our master of the closing this, but thanks so much. Have a good night.